Because their village shared a border with Cameroon, Eyak's little restaurant received customers from both sides of the border almost every day. Traders crossing from Cameroon stopped by for a quick meal. Farmers returning from their farms came in hungry and tired. Drivers passing through the busy border routes knew that if they wanted a delicious, home-cooked meal, there was one place they could always count on. And this is the story of how the woman everyone loved almost lost everything because of the one person she trusted most. Eyak was a beautiful woman. At 44, she still carried herself with a quiet elegance that made people notice her whenever she walked through the village. She was peaceful, kind, accommodating, and exceptionally well-mannered. She lived in an Ejagham community in Cross River State, in a part of the region where the culture stretched across the modern border into Cameroon. For generations, Ejagham communities had existed on both sides of that border, sharing a deep cultural heritage despite eventually finding themselves in two different countries. The lush green landscape around Eyak's village was beautiful. Tall trees surrounded the settlement, farmland stretched beyond the houses, and the sound of motorcycles, traders, farmers, and travelers filled the roads leading toward the border. It was a place where Nigerian and Cameroonian traders could meet, exchange goods, and continue their journeys. And right beside one of those busy routes stood Eyak's restaurant. It wasn't a huge restaurant. It was a modest, open-fronted place with wooden benches, a few sturdy tables, and a large cooking area behind the building. The smell coming from Eyak's kitchen could make a hungry traveler stop in his tracks. She prepared delicious Ejagham meals using ingredients familiar to the people of the region: yam, cassava, plantain, leafy vegetables, palm oil, smoked fish, and different kinds of meat. Some days she prepared a pang. On other days, she served dishes made with yam, plantain, or cassava, accompanied by richly seasoned soups and sauces. Her kitchen was especially loved by customers who enjoyed meals prepared with smoked fish and local meats. And Eyak didn't just serve food, she served it with warmth. Whenever a customer entered, she greeted them with a smile. If someone complained that the food was too spicy, she laughed. If a regular customer came in looking tired, she would tease them until they smiled. And if someone didn't have enough money to pay for a full meal, Eyak was the type of woman who would quietly reduce the price rather than embarrass them. That was why people loved her. Some customers came for the food. Others came because they simply enjoyed sitting in Eyak's restaurants. Eyak was married to a man named Efang. Efang was 49 years old and worked as a shoe trader in one of the popular markets in the area. He wasn't a wealthy man, neither was Eyak, but together they were comfortable. They had a modest home, enough food to eat, and enough money to take care of their everyday needs. They lived like an average Nigerian family, and despite not having much, Eyak and Efang had something money couldn't buy. They had love. Every evening, after finishing his day's business at the market, Efang would leave his shoe store and come to Eyak's restaurant. He would sit somewhere nearby and wait patiently for her to finish serving her last customers. Sometimes he would help her carry things. Sometimes he simply sat there watching her work. And when she finally closed the restaurant, they would both climb onto their small tricycle. Efang would drive, Eyak would sit behind him, and together they would make their way home. It was their little routine, a simple life, a peaceful life, or so it seemed. Because there was one thing missing from that home, something they had prayed for year after year, something that had slowly become the deepest wound in Eyak's heart, a child. Eyak and Efang had been married for 19 years. 19 years without a child. Eyak was already 44, Efang was 49, and as the years passed, the silence inside their home became harder to ignore. Eyak tried everything. She took herbs, she visited health workers, she consulted midwives, she visited churches, she attended prayer meetings, she went to prayer houses, she fasted, she prayed. Sometimes she would kneel beside her bed late at night, crying until her voice became weak. Other nights, she would simply lap down with tears running silently down her cheeks. But every morning, she woke up, washed her face, dressed beautifully, and opened her restaurants. To her customers, Eyak was still the cheerful woman they knew. She joked, she laughed, she served food, she welcomed everyone. But sometimes, when the restaurant became quiet and there was nobody around, Eyak would sit alone on one of the wooden benches. She would stare into space, and the smile would disappear from her face. Then the tears would come. She would quickly wipe them away whenever she heard footsteps approaching, because Eyak didn't want anyone to know how broken she truly felt. Efang loved his wife. There was no doubt about that. He had stood beside her through 19 difficult years. But slowly, something inside him was changing. His patience was beginning to run thin. Every day at his shoe store, he watched parents come into the market with their children. Some mothers would hold their little girls' hands while shopping. Some fathers would bring their sons to choose new shoes. Sometimes, a child would sit beside him while he measured their feet, and Efang would smile. But deep inside, his heart would ache. He would quietly think, when will I have a child of my own? He never said it aloud, but the thought followed him home. Eyak had a close friend named Ifi. Ifi was 4 years younger than Eyak. She was 40 years old and unmarried. She made a living selling local produce and food in the market, items that people in the community bought for their homes and restaurants. Ifi and Eyak had been friends for years. They talked about everything. They laughed together. They visited each other, and Eyak trusted Ifi deeply, perhaps too deeply. Because one afternoon, after another painful reminder of her childlessness, Eyak finally told Ifi something she had never told another woman. Not even her closest relatives knew. Only her husband knew. They were sitting together when Eyak suddenly became quiet. Her eyes filled with tears. Ifi, her voice trembled. Ifi looked at her. What is it? Eyak wiped her eyes. There is something I have never told anyone. Ifi moved closer. What is it? Eyak took a deep breath. Then she began to tell her friend the secret she had carried for decades. When she was much younger, while she was still in secondary school, Eyak had been involved in an affair. She became pregnant. Terrified of shame and afraid of what people would say, she made the painful decision to terminate the pregnancy. That was many years ago, and since then, she had never become pregnant again. She had visited doctors, she had undergone examinations, and according to the doctors, she was still physically capable of carrying a pregnancy. But Eyak couldn't stop wondering, what if that is the reason? What if that is why I have never conceived again? She broke down crying. I don't know what to do anymore, Ifi. Ifi immediately embraced her. My friend, please don't cry. But while Ifi held her friend and comforted her, something very different was happening inside her mind. Ife had just heard a secret that would change all three of their lives. Ife went home that evening thinking about everything Eyak had told her. She thought about Eyak's marriage. She thought about Ifang. She thought about the fact that she herself had never been married. And then an ugly thought entered her mind. What if I give Ifang the child he has always wanted? At first, she tried to push the thought away, but the more she thought about it, the more she convinced herself that Eyak was the reason Ifang had remained childless. She began telling herself, Eyak will never give him a child. Ifang needs a woman who can give him children. And eventually, another thought took root. If I become pregnant for him, he will have no choice but to marry me. Ife had crossed a line, but she didn't stop. One afternoon, Ife walked into Ifang's shoe store. She pretended she wanted to buy a pair of shoes. Ifang welcomed her. They began talking about the shoes. Then they started joking. Then they began talking about life. One conversation became another, and soon their conversations became personal. Ife started visiting more often. Sometimes she genuinely bought something. Other times she simply came to talk. Ifang didn't realize where the relationship was heading. Neither did Eyak, until one day. The friendship between Ife and Ifang crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They began seeing each other secretly, behind Eyak's back. And before either of them understood the consequences of what they were doing, Ife became pregnant. When Ifang heard that Ife was pregnant, he was overwhelmed with happiness. He screamed, Obasi, Gafolisho, meaning God has done it. For 19 years, he had dreamed of hearing the words, you are going to be a father. Now they had finally come. He couldn't contain himself. He wanted to tell Eyak. He didn't stop to think about what the news would do to her. It was a Sunday afternoon. Eyak and Ifang had just returned from church. They had eaten their Sunday meal and were sitting together at home. Then Ifang cleared his throat. Eyak, she looked at him. There is something I need to tell you. What is it? Ifang smiled. Someone is pregnant. Eyak froze. For almost 3 minutes, she didn't say a word. She simply stared at him. Then tears slowly began rolling down her cheeks. Why? That was all she could say. Why? Ifang looked at her. Then, instead of comforting his wife, he said something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But Eyak, I have tried. Eyak stared at him through her tears. 19 solid years of waiting, Ifang continued, and yet nothing. He shook his head. Is it when I am close to my grave that I will start having children? Eyak couldn't take it anymore. She stood up and walked into the bedroom. That night was the longest night of her life. The next morning, Eyak woke up before Ifang. She dressed quietly. She didn't prepare breakfast. She didn't wake her husband. She simply picked up her things and went to her restaurant. When she arrived, she opened the shop but didn't even have the strength to cook. She sat down, pulled out her phone and called Ife. Ife, come to the restaurant, please. Ife arrived shortly afterward. The moment she stepped inside, Eyak rushed toward her. She wrapped her arms around her friend and began crying uncontrollably. Ife held her. My friend, what happened? She gently wiped Eyak's tears. What happened? Eyak could barely speak. Ifang, she cried harder. Ifang has impregnated another woman. For one brief moment, Ife's heart skipped, but she quickly controlled herself. She asked softly, "Did he tell you who the woman is?" Eyak shook her head. "No." She wiped her face. "I was too broken to ask." For the first time that morning, Ife felt a tiny sense of relief. She stayed with Eyak for the rest of the day, comforting her. Then she eventually left, and Eyak remained there, broken. As the weeks passed, Eyak became a shadow of herself. Some days, she didn't even open the restaurant. Other days, she opened it but barely spoke. Meanwhile, Ifang seemed happier than he had been in years. He continued his shoe business. He secretly continued seeing Ife. Then, after about a month, Ife began putting pressure on him. She threatened to terminate the pregnancy if he refused to marry her. Ifang panicked. Eventually, he made his decision. He went home to speak to Eyak. "Eyak," she looked at him, "my child cannot be born without a proper home." Eyak's heart sank. "I need to marry the mother of my child." Tears immediately filled Eyak's eyes. She knew there was nothing she could say that would change his mind. She could cry, she could fight, she could scream, but Ifang had already made his decision. After a long silence, Eyak finally whispered, "Who is she?" Ifang paused. He swallowed. He adjusted himself in his chair. Then he said, "Ife." The room became completely silent. Eyak stared at him. She slowly whispered, "Which Ife?" Ifang swallowed again. "Which other Ife do you know?" He looked at her. "Your best friend, of course." Eyak froze. Her body began trembling. She pinched herself. Once, twice, as though she needed to make sure she wasn't dreaming. But she wasn't. The woman she had trusted with her deepest secrets, the woman she had hugged while crying, the woman who had held her and promised to comfort her, was carrying her husband's child. Eyak's legs gave way. She fell from the chair, and the cry that came from her mouth was not the cry of an angry woman. It was the cry of a woman whose heart had just been shattered by the two people she trusted most. She cried until her voice became weak. She cried until she could barely breathe. And as she lay on the floor, one question kept repeating in her mind: how could my best friend do this to me? But Eyak didn't know her story was far from over. The following morning, Eyak struggled to get out of bed. Her body felt weak. Her eyes were swollen from crying throughout the night. She slowly sat up and stared at the empty space beside her. Ifang had not come home. But his words from the previous evening kept replaying in her mind. Your best friend, of course. Ife. Her Ife? The woman she had trusted with the deepest secret of her life. The woman she had cried into her arms. The woman who had comforted her when she thought her marriage was falling apart. Eyak covered her face with both hands. She tried to convince herself that perhaps she had misunderstood. Perhaps Ifang had made a mistake. Perhaps there was another woman called Ife. But deep down, she knew the truth. It was her best friend, her heart shattered all over again. Eyak wondered what she should do. Should she go to Ife's house and confront her? Should she fight her? Should she demand an explanation? Should she tell the whole village what Ife had done? Or should she simply leave everything in God's hands? The more she thought about it, the more she cried. Just then, the door opened. Ifang walked into the room. He had not slept at home that night. He looked at Eyak and sighed. Eyak, you have to accept this. She said nothing. Ife is carrying my child. You should see this as God's blessing. Eyak stared at him. Not one word came from her mouth. She simply stood up and walked away. For several days, Eyak thought about confronting Ife, but eventually she made a decision. She wasn't going to fight. She wasn't going to insult Ife. She wasn't going to expose her. She wasn't going to revenge. She decided to leave everything in God's hands. Ifang told Ife that he had already told Eyak about the pregnancy. After hearing that, Ife completely avoided Eyak. She stopped calling. She stopped visiting the restaurant. She acted as though the friendship they had shared for years had never existed. Instead, Ife became completely focused on one thing, her wedding to Ifang. And soon the day came. Ifang married Ife, and because Ife constantly pressured him, she eventually moved into the home he had shared with Eyak. The woman who once sat beside Eyak and wiped her tears had now entered that same home as her husband's new wife. But something frightening happened. A side of Ife that Eyak had never seen before came alive. She became cold, proud, controlling. Even the sight of Eyak irritated her. She behaved as though Eyak was an unwanted stranger living in her own home. Before long, Ife convinced Ifang to remove Eyak from the matrimonial bedroom. The room that had once belonged to Eyak was now Ife's. Eyak watched silently as her belongings were moved. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She simply picked up her things and walked away. But Ife wasn't satisfied. She wanted Eyak to feel the pain she believed she deserved. Sometimes, Ife would deliberately say things like, "You see why I told you to accept reality," or "Some women are simply not meant to have children." Eyak heard every word, but she refused to respond. She would simply turn around and walk away. Every morning, Eyak left the house early. She went straight to her restaurant. She worked harder than ever. She introduced new recipes. She experimented with different Ejagham dishes. Her customers began enjoying meals such as epangafu, plantain porridge, yam porridge, and soups made with local ingredients. Her restaurant became known for its rich aromas and generous portions. People traveling through the area stopped there to eat. Traders came, farmers came, drivers came. Even customers crossing between communities connected to the Nigeria-Cameroon border would sometimes stop to eat before continuing their journey. Ejagham food became the heart of Eyak's business, with dishes made from ingredients deeply rooted in the region: yam, plantain, cassava, leafy vegetables, palm oil, smoked fish, and different meats. But while customers saw a smiling businesswoman, they didn't see what happened after the restaurant closed. When the last customer left, when the chairs were empty, when the cooking fire had gone quiet, Eyak would sit alone and cry. Sometimes she cried until her chest hurt. Then she would wipe her face, stand up, and prepare for another day. People who knew what had happened in her marriage couldn't understand her. How can Eyak still smile? How can she still work? How can she behave as though nothing happened? But Eyak had made a decision. She would not allow betrayal to destroy her completely. While Eyak was rebuilding herself quietly, Ifang was enjoying his new life. He was excited about becoming a father. He treated Ife like a queen. Whatever she wanted, he provided. Whatever she complained about, he fixed. Whatever she demanded, he tried to give her. And whenever Ify complained about Eyak, Ifang took Ify's side. He didn't realize that he was slowly destroying the woman who had loved him for 19 years. Then Ify's pregnancy reached 8 months. One evening, she looked at Ifang and said, "I don't feel safe around Eyak." Ifang frowned. "What do you mean?" "I don't trust her." Ify lowered her voice. "She barely talks. She's always quiet. What if she's planning something?" Ifang looked towards the room where Eyak was staying. Ify continued, "What if she wants to harm me or my baby?" Ifang believed her, and without thinking deeply about it, he made another terrible decision. He sent Eyak away. Eyak cried. She begged, "Ifang, where will I go?" But he refused to listen. That night, Eyak had nowhere to sleep, so she went to her restaurant. She arranged some things in a corner, and that became her sleeping place. During the day, she served customers with a smile. At night, she closed the restaurant and slept there alone. Nobody knew. Her smile never disappeared when customers were around, and instead of allowing her pain to destroy her, she poured everything she had into her business. Her restaurant became busier. She hired 2 workers. She expanded her menu. She began receiving larger food orders. Soon, customers were ordering food for meetings, ceremonies, and celebrations. Eyak's small restaurant was becoming something much bigger. Meanwhile, Ify gave birth, not to one child, but twins, a boy and a girl. When Ifang heard the news, he couldn't contain himself. After 19 years of waiting, he finally believed his dream had come true. He danced, he celebrated, he bought drinks, he called people, he thanked God. He looked at the 2 babies and cried tears of joy. "My children!" He treated Ify like royalty. He bought her gifts. He bought beautiful clothes for the babies. He was convinced that his life had fading changed. For the first time in 19 years, Ifang believed he had everything he wanted. But he didn't know that the greatest shock of his life was waiting for him. At first, everything seemed fine, but after the twins turned 1, something began changing. One child became sick, then the other. They recovered, then going sick again. At first, Ifang assumed they were ordinary childhood illnesses, but the sickness became more frequent. The children became weak. They were constantly taking medication. Hospital visits became part of their daily lives. Ifang spent more and more money on treatment. His shoe business began suffering. He borrowed money, sold belongings, used the savings, anything to court his children alive. The joy that once filled his home disappeared. There were working senseless nights, hospital corridors, prescriptions, injections, fear, and exceeding tears. Then one day, a doctor who had been treating the children asked Ifang to sit down. "Mr. Ifang, I need to ask you something." Ifang looked worried. "What is it, doctor?" The doctor hesitated. "Were you and your wife ever tested for genotype before having these children?" Ifang frowned. "Yes." The doctor looked at him carefully. "Do you know your genotype?" "Of course," Ifang replied. "I am AA." The doctor looked at the file. "That cannot explain what we are seeing." Ifang became nervous. "What do you mean?" The doctor explained that both children had tested SS. Ifang stared at him. "SS?" "Yes." "But I'm AA." The doctor nodded. "That's exactly why we need to investigate further." Ifang's heart began beating faster. He asked for another test, then another. He wanted certainty. The tests were repeated. The children were confirmed SS. Efang was confirmed AA. Effie was confirmed AS. The doctor sat quietly for a moment. Then he spoke carefully. An AA father and an AS mother cannot biologically produce an SS child. So these results mean we need to establish biological paternity. Efang felt cold. He couldn't speak. The doctor recommended a definitive DNA paternity test. Efang agreed. The test was done. Days later, the result arrived. Efang went to the hospital alone. The doctor handed him the report. Efang looked down, then froze. He read it again and again. The result was clear. Efang was not the biological father of the twins. His hands began trembling. His entire world collapsed. The woman he had betrayed Eyak for, the woman he had married, the woman he had trusted, had deceived him. Efang returned home carrying the result. Effie was sitting with the children. The moment she saw his face, she knew something was wrong. Efang threw the report on the table. "Who is the father of these children?" Effie froze. She tried to speak. Nothing came out. Efang's voice shook with anger. "Who?" Effie began crying. She fell to her knees. "Efang, please." "Who?" Effie covered her face. Then finally, she confessed. The children were not Efang's. They belonged to another man. In fact, Effie admitted that before meeting Efang, she had been involved with several men. But after Eyak told her about her past pregnancy and her fears about infertility, Effie saw an opportunity. She knew Efang desperately wanted children. She became pregnant by another man and deliberately allowed Efang to believe the pregnancy was his. She had planned to use the child to force him to marry her. She had never cared about the damage it would cause Eyak. Efang stared at her. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then tears began flowing down his face. He thought about Eyak, the woman who had stood beside him for 19 years, the woman who had cried silently, the woman he had abandoned, the woman whose best friend he had chosen over her. And suddenly, he understood. He had destroyed the wrong person. That night, he told Effie to leave. He could no longer look at her. His marriage had been built on betrayal, and now the truth had destroyed everything. Efang's life changed completely. He lost his business. He became withdrawn. He drank heavily. Some days, he barely spoke. And every single day, he regretted Eyak. He remembered the woman who had never fought him, the woman who had never insulted Effie, the woman who had quietly walked away. He wanted to find her, but he didn't know where she was, because Eyak had moved on. While Efang was falling apart, Eyak was rising. Her restaurant in Ejagham had grown so successful that she eventually rented it out and moved to Calabar. There, she opened a much larger restaurant. Her cooking became her identity. Her customers loved her food. Her staff grew. She opened branches. She catered for weddings, celebrations, meetings, and major events. Her reputation spread. The woman who once cried alone in a tiny restaurant was now running a thriving food business. She even secured large catering contracts. And whenever someone asked her about marriage, she simply smiled. She had decided she would never marry again. Instead, she adopted 2 children from infancy. She raised them as her own. She gave them the love she had spent 19 years praying to give to a child. And for the first time in her life, her home was filled with children's laughter. One afternoon, Eyak was inside her restaurant when one of her workers came to her. "Madam, there is a man outside asking to see you." "Who?" "He said his name is Efang." Eyak froze. After 2 years, he had found her. She stepped outside, and there he was. Efang looked nothing like the man she remembered. He was thinner, tired, broken. The moment he saw Eyak, he fell to his knees. "Eyak," she stood quietly. "I am sorry." Tears streamed down his face. "I destroyed everything." Eyak said nothing. "I betrayed you." He lowered his head. "I believed someone else over you. I treated you terribly. I threw you out of your own home. Please forgive me." Eyak looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly, "I forgive you." Efang looked up. Hope appeared in his eyes. But Eyak continued, "But forgiveness does not mean I will return to the life you destroyed." His face fell. "I cannot marry you again." Efang began crying. "Eyak, please." She shook her head. "I have forgiven you, Efang. But I have also learned how to live without you." She looked towards her restaurant, towards the life she had built, towards the children waiting for her at home. "I spent 19 years waiting for you to make me a mother. Then you left me when I needed you most. Now I have found peace." She took a breath. "I wish you well." Then she respectfully asked him never to come looking for her again. And Efang knew. He had lost her forever. Ife's life was not better. She struggled every day. The 2 children still needed care, and she had no idea which of the men she had been involved with was their biological father. She thought about Eyak constantly. She remembered the secret Eyak had trusted her with. She remembered the tears, the hugs, the friendship, and she regretted everything. But regret could not erase what she had done. She had wanted another woman's husband. She had used her friend's deepest pain as an opportunity. And eventually, her own deception destroyed the life she thought she was building. Eyak's story teaches us that our choices, our trust, and the people we allow into our lives can shape our future. Eyak made the mistake of entering a sexual relationship while she was still in secondary school, which resulted in a pregnancy she later terminated because of shame. Young people should understand that sex comes with serious emotional, physical, and life-changing consequences. Don't rush into relationships or sexual activity before you are mature enough to handle those consequences. Eyak told Ife something deeply personal because she believed she was her friend. Sadly, Ife used that information against her. You can love people and still have boundaries. Not everyone deserves access to your deepest vulnerabilities. Ife saw Eyak's weakness as an opportunity to take her husband. Jealousy and envy can make people do things they later regret. Efang desperately wanted children, but his desperation caused him to hurt the woman who had stood beside him for 19 years. What we desperately want should never make us abandon wisdom and loyalty. Eyak forgave Efang, but she chose not to marry him again. You can forgive someone while still protecting your peace and maintaining healthy boundaries. Eyak was deeply hurt, but she rebuilt her life, grew her business, and found happiness again. Sometimes the end of one chapter is the beginning of another. A man reaps what he sows. Galatians 6:7. What we do matters. Let us choose wisely, protect the trust people place in us, avoid decisions we may later regret, and never allow jealousy or desperation to control our lives. If this story touched you, like, share, and subscribe for more African stories with powerful lessons and beautiful cultures. Thank you for watching, and may God give us wisdom to make better choices.